Mr. Speaker, Chairperson, dear colleagues, dear friends, let me begin by thanking you all very much for being with us today, whether physically in Paris here, those of you that are in this room, or connected online for this conference. We have been planning this conference quite a long time, and because of the pandemic, we've had problems in organizing it. We had planned to meet in Stockholm, but the pandemic disrupted our plans several times with a change of date first and then a change of place. So we are here in Paris today, but really not in Paris, we should be in Stockholm. In the end, we are meeting in the premises of the Council of Europe in Paris, but thanks to technology, most Swedish speakers will take the floor from Stockholm, and Alliance members and other participants are attending from all over Europe. I would like to thank the main supporters of this initiative, the Swedish Parliament and the Council of Europe, represented respectively by Dr. Nolen, the Speaker of my Parliament, and Mr. Björn Berger, Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe. And within the Swedish Parliament, more specifically the delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly, headed by my colleague here, Ms. Boriana Obay. I will say a few more words on the scope and the goals and objectives of this conference shortly, but first of all, I would like to give the floor to the three distinguished guests I have mentioned earlier on. So first, Dr. Nolen, speaking from Stockholm, welcome once again, and the floor is yours, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, distinguished members of Parliament, Mr. Deputy Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen. There is protection from near everything, from fire and damage by storm and frost. Oh, add whichever blow may come to mind, but there is no protection from mankind. These are the beautiful words of the Swedish Nobel laureate Harry Martinson from his epic poem Aniara, translated by our translators here at the Swedish Parliament. No, there is no protection from ourselves if we do not stand up, every one of us, to protect and defend humanity against racism, discrimination, and intolerance. Equal treatment, openness, and tolerance are values standing at the very center of democracy. And at the same time, they are tools, the tools we need to form this protection. And yes, there are many, even countless champions for those values among us around the world. But still, all our efforts are very much needed as those values are being challenged every day. So one might ask, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, the answer is twofold. It is both about what we do individually, the choices we make, and about what we do together. We always have to reflect upon our own actions when we face xenophobia, intolerance, or undemocratic actions. And as parliamentarians, we have to make this an integrated part of our political duties. We must work tirelessly to defend and develop democracy. Democracy can never be taken for granted. Even in Sweden, where I believe democracy stands strong, it is a fairly new phenomenon from a historical point of view. The Parliament is celebrating 100 years of Swedish democracy with the Democracy Jubilee between 2018 and 2022. And in fact, in September, just 1 month ago, we celebrated the centenary commemoration of the first time women were allowed to vote and to stand for parliamentary election. In 1922, the first 5 women finally entered Parliament, a great step towards a more equal Parliament, but there were still many obstacles to overcome. These are examples of milestones just a couple of generations away. They are milestones not only in the work towards gender equality, but also in the fields of inclusiveness and non-discrimination at all levels, important in Sweden and elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy could certainly not be taken for granted 100 years ago, nor can it be taken for granted today, even in Europe. Every generation has to be one for the ideals of democracy and human rights. Just as democracy and democratic development prevailed 100 years ago in Sweden, I firmly believe that it will also stand strong today and tomorrow. We now know the importance of diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination. In fact, non-discrimination is a cornerstone in the European Convention on Human Rights. It is a cornerstone in the work of this alliance assembled here today, very well displayed in the example of this conference. I believe one noticeable threat to democracy is hate, threats, and violent acts directed against elected representatives and civil servants. The ultimate consequence is cases such as the recent murder of Sir David MS, the British MP, a truly horrifying act. But also, representatives silencing their own voices due to hate and abusive language is a threat to democracy itself. The Council of Europe and its parliamentary dimension holds a long tradition of being a strong defender of democracy and plays an important role in this sense. I also mention the responsibility we carry as members of parliament to defend and develop democracy. With parliament being the heart of democracy, this goes without saying, but nevertheless, I would like to emphasize the parliamentary dimension of democratic work. Much can be achieved both in parliaments and in interparliamentary work to promote democracy, defend human rights, and combat hate speech and intolerance. Your alliance is an important part of this work, and I wish you a fruitful conference and an interesting day full of perspectives and interesting aspects of these important matters. I would like to especially thank the coordinator of the alliance, Swedish MP Momodo Malcolm Jallow, for his dedicated work, and the Swedish delegation for co-hosting this event. The work of your alliance and the work that each of you who are participating today undertake is a part of the protection against the dark sides of mankind mentioned in the poem. Thank you for keeping this spirit and for doing this work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nolan, Mr. Speaker, for those really inspiring words. Really appreciate all your work and commitment in the work that we're doing to protect democracy, as you put it. So thank you so much. And now let me give the floor to Mr. Bjorn Bayer, also speaking remotely, the Deputy Secretary General. Thank you once again for your support, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, and the Swedish Riksdag for their commitment to addressing the grim realities of racism in Europe today. The Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly has a distinguished record in tackling racial discrimination in our member states, and in you, Mr. Jallow, it has a strong and active General Rapporteur to help steer that work in the right direction. Racial prejudice and intolerance can never be excused or should never be accepted. They are inherently unacceptable. They perpetuate inequality, and they erode individuals' dignity, opportunity, and capacity to realize their proper potential. They are also a violation of the respect and fundamental rights to which everyone on the European continent is entitled. Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights prohibits discrimination on any grounds, such as race, color, language, and national origin. The Convention has been ratified by every one of the Council of Europe's 47 member states and has the force of law across our common legal space. Governments must therefore implement it, and in particular, the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. This is not some sort of request, but a basic legal requirement. I also want to add the following. Those countries that have not yet ratified Protocol 12 should also do so, as this provides a more general ban on discrimination, which is right, proper, and moral, not least when we see today how widespread racism remains. Yes, many European societies have gone further than ever before to recognize and confront racism, but progress is patchy, uneven, and incomplete. We need to do more. That's why the Council of Europe is working with member states to help them bridge the gap to genuine equality. Our general policy recommendation on combating racism and racial discrimination is designed to help national authorities identify these practices, ban them, and conduct effective and independent investigations. Our cooperation programs have developed tools to root out institutional racism and enhance states' capacity to confront it, including within law enforcement agencies such as the police, not least to increase victims' trust in the authorities and their confidence in reporting crimes. And we have taken steps to help member states with systemic racism too. This is not necessarily about deliberate wrongdoing. Rather, it is where discrimination has become embedded in a way that policymakers, employers, and service providers operate. This can be subtle, but insidious. Here, our ever-expanding Intercultural Cities program has helped local authorities to recognize where prejudice hides, the factors that feed it, and how to ensure the cooperation, respect, and trust that it should replace it. Because a community that embraces each of its members is one that thrives for the benefit of all. This philosophy also underpins our model framework for an intercultural integration strategy and the complementary recommendation that we are now drafting for the governments of our member states, both of which are designed to tackle the problem through inclusive policies at every level of government. In terms of specific communities, we have a new recommendation on preventing and combating anti-Semitism, a revised recommendation on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, which will be published next year, and a strategic action plan for Roma and traveler inclusion, all of which are designed to help determine, prevent, and remedy the hate that is all too often directed at people from these groups. We also undertake a range of activities to protect migrants and asylum seekers who often face hostility while seeking a better life. Dear friends, but we all know that individual policies are not enough. Ultimately, change must come from the bottom up. For European societies to embrace inclusion and reject racism whenever and wherever it rears its head. Certainly, we can help encourage that change. And we are at work on a comprehensive approach to addressing hate speech, including online, where racism is not only widespread, but enabled by anonymity and stoked by extremism. This will include proposals on clearly defined legal frameworks, regulation of the internet and internet companies, and non-legal measures such as awareness raising, victim support, and national and international cooperation. Our newly created Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, Diversity and Inclusion provides an intergovernmental, expert-driven structure that is guiding that work. Of course, the complex intersectional nature of racism is deeply entrenched. Its historical and contemporary roots must be explored and understood, and steps taken to break down the cultural barriers that stand in the way of progress. The Council of Europe is ready to play its part. Your work in the Parliamentary Assembly will be crucial, including your No Hate Parliamentary Alliance that is doing such good work in pushing for change. Ultimately, we must take a human rights-centered approach, and human rights belong to everyone. While racism persists, our job is not done. I wish you a successful conference, exploring and discussing key areas, and last but not least, how we can together make a difference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagia, for those well-chosen words and for raising very sensitive issues as systemic racism that has been raised this past year and how it affects people in different sectors of society. I also want to thank you for the very good recommendations that you mentioned here, issues that we are working on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and migrants, refugees. These are very important and current issues that we need to look at and we need to face. So I am very grateful. We are very grateful from the Alliance and the committee for your commitment and for your support. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Boriana Obay, the Chairperson of the Swedish Delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much for coming to Paris with me to represent the Swedish delegation. You have the floor for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Speaker, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure on behalf of the Swedish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe to welcome you to this conference. I'm glad that we finally managed to organize it after 2 years of trials and preparations. As the General Rapporteur against Racism and Intolerance, Mr. Yallow, mentioned, we are a bit saddened for not being able to host the conference in the Swedish Riksdag, but we're grateful for the opportunity to have it in a hybrid mode from the Council of Europe's beautiful building in Paris. When in Paris, I'm always reminded of the motto of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. These 3 words are not only the fundamental values of the French society, but also universal values, values that must be protected every day. Values that embody all humans' equal worth and everyone's equality before the law. And that reminds us that the responsibility for a free and equal society rests upon us all. Sweden has a long tradition of supporting and addressing human rights. Sweden has also a long-standing record of protecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Our society is built upon the foundation that everyone is equal and that everyone has the same possibilities regardless of gender, age, origin, or skin color. It's not coincidence that so many people from other countries have chosen to seek refuge in Sweden due to its freedom, social cohesion, welfare, and democracy. Just above 2 million people 20% of Swedish residents are born abroad. Many studies have shown that Sweden is one of the least xenophobic countries in the world. But is everything perfect in Sweden? Of course not. Is racism a thing of the past in Sweden? Unfortunately, not. Still, it occurs that people are discriminated due to appearance and origin, despite us having strong legislation against ethnic discrimination and other kinds of discrimination. There's also another kind of racism that is considerably harder to get hold of, the racism of low expectations. For decades, a caretaking and condescending attitude towards people born abroad has taken away many's independence and ability to succeed on their own merits. A mentality of victimhood has been established where failures are often ascribed to a structural discrimination which permeate all of society. A cultivated role as an outsider, marginalized, and a loser has a tendency to be of a self-fulfilling character, and this is something that causes division within society. All of the parties in the Swedish Riksdag agree that racism should be opposed by all means. We may have different ideas of how the struggle against racism should be addressed, but we all share the conviction that in a modern society, all people must be judged by their actions, not by their origin. It's important to be open to new knowledge and new perspectives, and I hope that this conference will contribute to this with the help of all the distinguished speakers and experts from several countries, sectors, and institutions. And I'd like to thank Mr. Mamadou Malcolm Jallow, the General Rapporteur against Racism and Intolerance, and our Secretariat for their devoted work organizing this conference. And thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Boriana Obay, and I just want to thank you for supporting this initiative from the beginning and for all the commitment and support that you've shown throughout these past 2 years since I've been appointed General Rapporteur. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I can only welcome and appreciate the increasing awareness among national and international institutions of the importance and urgency of combating racism and intolerance. The support we received from the organization of this event was unanimous in Stockholm and in Strasbourg. I would like to say a few words on what the aim and objectives of this event is. Over the 2 years of my term in office as General Rapporteur on combating racism and intolerance, I have spared no effort to give new impetus to the action of the Parliamentary Assembly in the fight against racism and all forms of intolerance. That is part of my mission. That is why I was appointed as General Rapporteur. The violent death of George Floyd, as we all know, at the hands of police in Minneapolis shook us to the core, and it triggered a series of protests in every major city in Europe and around the world. The scale and intensity of the protests triggered by his death was unprecedented. Europeans of all backgrounds, especially in the younger generation, felt that they needed to act, and they joined a protest around the world. That was a movement and not a moment. It's a real movement that expressed frustration, pain, and trauma and solidarity and called for change. A movement that was and still is deeply and permanently committed to the values of justice and human rights. As political leaders, we cannot ignore this call this time around. For many of us, and especially these young people, this was an eye-opener and a window of opportunity that we need to take. The intersection between Black Lives Matter movement and the corona pandemic and crisis has revealed the existence of structural and systemic racism in European institutions, structures that have been shaped by centuries of oppression against racialized groups and is still having an impact in the racialized groups today. However, the lack of political will to acknowledge, speak out against, and address the documented and lived experience of racism has been one of the most significant barriers in achieving equality. There is a profound lack of acknowledgement of the existence of structural and institutional racism, its dimensions, and its historical correlations in political and public debate. The cases and patterns of human rights violation affecting people, for example, of African descent and Muslims, are not given adequate consideration, even when they are reliably attested. That needs to change. Issues raised by human rights defenders with respect to racism and racial discrimination against migrants, for example, are often deflected and ignored. In general, there is little recognition of the vulnerability of certain racialized groups, and often violations of their human rights are not publicly condemned. That needs to change. Ladies and gentlemen, so what do we need to do? We need to combat racism at its roots, therefore tackle the structural and historical aspect of it. We need to move beyond tackling individual acts of racism and address the structural inequalities and for racialized people, laying the ground for unleashing the individual acts. We see how racialized groups are criminalized and over-policed. We continue to witness the increasing racial profiling, violence at the borders in the name of counterterrorism policies. Today, too often, the intersection between ethnicity, gender, religion, and migration background are markers of exclusion and disenfranchisement. Earlier this year, the Assembly adopted its fourth resolution on Afrophobia or anti-Black racism, which was urgently needed. Two reports are currently under preparation, respectively on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, two forms of intolerance that poison our society. It is crucial to remain vigilant, to learn how to detect even the early signs of these phenomena, how to prevent them and to counter them. In addition, the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination will soon begin work on the new Charter of European Political Parties for a non-racist society, an instrument based on political parties' self-regulation power, which may contribute to countering discrimination and to creating a more inclusive society in Council of Europe member states. We owe these achievements and the forthcoming endeavors to the support coming from the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance and the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, including, of course, its eminent chair, Ms. Petra Bayer, who, among other things, is preparing the report on anti-Semitism that I mentioned earlier. Ms. Petra Bayer, who's sitting right next to me, is amazing in bringing the best out of people. And as the chair of this committee, I really want to thank you for the eminent work that you've been doing. In spite of the recent achievements, our path towards equality is still long and not easy. Much work remains to be done. And today's conference is an opportunity to take stock of the situation and to identify the next steps that we should take. A variety of experts from civil society, academia, the media and the cultural sector, international organizations and national authorities will help us shed light on what racism looks like in Europe today and what should be done to counter it. From you, fellow legislators that are here and that are listening, we expect you to take active part in this conversation. We may expect both useful insights and, very importantly, political support. That is what we need, political will. We need vision, and let me add a bit of courage to continue our struggle towards a more equal society and a more equal Europe. So thank you so much and welcome to this conference. With that said, let me just take this opportunity to hand over the word to our eminent chair, Ms. Petra Bayer, who is going to be chairing the fourth session of this conference. And as I mentioned, Ms. Petra Bayer is an amazing leader that I am inspired by in so many ways. So please.
Thank you very much, Mamadou, for your very kind words. I do not know how we will rearrange now because we have one of our panelists here in the room and the others are online. And I think, are you staying here? Yeah. Okay. Everything's clear. Fine. Totally. No, everything is clear. So the first session is on Europe's political landscape nowadays and about the normalization of racism. And let me try to give you a brief, also historic introduction, how it came. Scientists say that there were a first wave of far right-wing populists in Europe in the 1970s, mostly focusing its critics on the social welfare state. And then with the second wave in the 1990s, they added European integration on the one hand, plus ethno-nationalistic and open racist discourse. And all over Europe, a spiral was starting to get to work, where racist prejudices openly were published. And at the beginning, it was a total provocation, and there was a lot of counter speech. But again, it was a provocation and more racist speech. And so the acceptance of this provocation, or the level when you want to fight against it, became higher and higher and higher, and it was more and more normalized. And first, for instance, there was also an agreement among media not to invite far right-wing racist politicians on their panels, but then they were criticized quite heavily, saying, oh, you do not want to engage with our arguments. That's an attack on freedom of speech. And so they made a lot of pressure, and in the end, also the far right wing with all their xenophobic, racist sentiments ended up in TV shows, on public panels. And again, the spiral was higher and higher, and racism became a political standpoint in the discourse and was at the table and was like any other standpoint as well. And with that, it gained more and more acceptance at the audience, but also among the voters. And when then the first right-wing parties with their xenophobic racism argument started to enter governments, it happens that even established parties, right-wing, central, leftist, try to compete on these racist arguments to catch voters. And again, it was more and more normalized because it was in the middle of the discourse of everybody. And then there was also a point when these racist politicians really entered governments, really entered politics in a way that they could make decisions. And just to mention one Austrian example, when the nowadays leader of the Freedom Party of Austria, which is one of those parties, became Minister for Interior some years ago, his very first action was an order to the Public Relations Department of the Ministry of Interior that whenever there is a femicide happening and the perpetrator is not an indigenous Austrian, the nationality and the origin of the origin must be mentioned in the press release to create the idea that whenever there is violence against women, connotated with early and forced marriage, with female genital mutilation, it is a migrants' issues. It's a kind of establishing xenophobia really within the ministries. And that we are going to debate now. In this first panel, we are trying to, on the one hand, to really look for recommendations for very practical use for our political work, for reports, for new perspectives. And we will have a couple of inputs, four from online, one is in the room, which is really great. And we will then have a short break, then have an hour for debate, and then have a lunch break. all the input givers are asked to keep to 7 to 8 minutes maximum with their inputs, because we are already a little bit ahead schedule. And I brought a red card for those who are much over the 7 or 8 minutes to wave with the red card. So the very first speaker is Cecilia Rustrom-Rubin. She is Ambassador for Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. And I hope we can get connected with her. And if so...
she should ask the floor.
Yeah, please ask for the floor. That's on the kudu system on the right, on the bottom. You did, obviously. And you...
She has the floor.
She has the floor. Okay, so please, Mrs. Rustrom-Rubin, it's yours.
Good morning, wonderful. I hope you can see and hear me well. Wonderful.
Perfect.
Good morning from Stockholm, and Madam Chair, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for organizing this important conference and for inviting me to participate. What we are discussing here today are matters which are really crucial to our democracies. As I'm representing the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, let me start with a global foreign view. And ladies and gentlemen, the trend that we are observing currently for our democracies is really troublesome. The democratic backsliding and the decline in the respect for human rights and the rule of law is clear, and the trend is global. Data shows that this is the first time since the 1970s that we experience such a clear negative development for democracy, with examples on every continent. This trend has been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to information from the VDEM Institute at the Gothenburg University, in 2020, we saw the situation deteriorating in more than 80 countries globally, and including in countries on our own continent. So against this background, I'm very glad to have been asked to provide some inputs about Swedish work, both at home and as part of our foreign policy. And let me start by focusing attention on one absolutely crucial area in our work to defend democracy, and that is the work to combat anti-Semitism and to promote Holocaust remembrance. Because less than 2 weeks ago, at the invitation of Prime Minister Stefan Löfven of Sweden, more than 75 delegations gathered in Malmö. This was heads of state and government, ministers, other representatives of governments, as well as international organizations, civil society organizations, experts, and also private sector representatives at the Malmö International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. They discussed a number of important areas: remembrance, Holocaust, education, anti-Semitism on social media, combating anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and other forms of racism. And most importantly, they made concrete pledges to strengthen their work and also to strengthen international cooperation in this area. Sweden is very honored to have been entrusted to take over the presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance starting next year and running for a full year. And when we are preparing for our presidency, we have also committed and pledged to follow up the pledges made at the Malmö Forum. Let me also mention some of the national pledges that Sweden did make at the Malmö Forum. Sweden will next year establish a museum to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust with stories of Holocaust survivors with a connection to Sweden as its starting point. Sweden will also next year present an action program against anti-Semitism, as well as action programs targeting anti-Gypsyism, Islamophobia, Afrophobia, and racism against Sami. Sweden is also enhancing police efforts to counter hate crime and to enhance capacities for monitoring anti-Semitism and other forms of racism online. Other efforts constitute of educational sector drives, as well as enhanced research. And ladies and gentlemen, this is all extremely important, because while Swedish democracy does stand on solid ground, we also recognize that we need to continue to defend it every day, and we need to continue to improve and do so continuously and tirelessly. Our speaker in his opening remarks mentioned that this year Sweden is celebrating 100 years of democracy. The government is celebrating this through initiatives, large-scale national initiatives to step up our work. One of those initiatives is the launching of a new platform to consult civil society on policy issues before decisions are made. And in Sweden, approximately 70% of our population are members of at least one civil society organization. So this is a major effort. Overall, the ambition from the Swedish government is to work knowledge-based and to take a strategic approach. And to that end, in 2018, the government launched a broad democracy strategy, which takes a holistic whole-of-government approach, both in terms of identifying and analyzing current weaknesses and challenges, and in terms of gathering initiatives. And let me mention three main challenges identified in this strategy. First of all, democratic exclusion, meaning that political participation in our society is uneven, with parts of the population not taking part in democracy. Secondly, threats to democratic discourse, with hate speech, threats, and violence directed towards participants in public discourse getting increasingly common. And thirdly, anti-democratic actors on the rise. So in Sweden, as in many other countries, anti-democratic actors are advancing their positions, with cyber hatred, disinformation, and propaganda systematically being used. Ladies and gentlemen, Sweden is since a long time also engaged internationally to promote principles, democratic principles and institutions abroad. And in 2019, the government further stepped up this work by launching a comprehensive foreign policy initiative, which we label a drive for democracy, that now places democracy at the center of Sweden's foreign, security, trade, and development policies. It has a concrete approach promoting democracy and engages our entire diplomatic system with really tangible results. So let me just mention that since its launch, we have, through our diplomatic missions abroad, hosted more than 600 activities and what we call democracy talks that have all in all engaged 1.7 million people globally, from grassroots organizations to government representatives, for inclusive discussions about the democratic challenges facing their communities. So there is a strong emphasis on civil society, on human rights defenders, on media, but also on women's rights, on LGBTI persons' rights, and also questions relating to rights in the work life. very important work is also carried out through our international development cooperation. And Sweden is, yes, thank you, I know. Sweden is already now allocating a quarter of its international development assistance to efforts in the area of human rights and democracy. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sweden will continue to take responsibility at home and abroad. And as you ask for recommendations, just let me give two. One is the need to invest in knowledge, in investing in monitoring developments, which are in many places going very fast in undermining democracy. And here, obviously, the mandates and institutions of the Council of Europe play a crucial role. Secondly, the importance of collaborations, the importance of coming together. So now is a really crucial time to come together to ensure that the norms and principles that are fundamental also to the Council of Europe are being respected. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank you very much for this really valuable inputs. I had the chance to follow the Malmö Forum for some sessions online. I had a plenary session in Austria at the same time, but it was really very, very interesting and very inspiring. And I think what you said, not only the two recommendations at the end, but really that it is about education, about awareness raising, and to have the chance to really talk to each other and to really frame racism as a threat for democracy is so really crucial. And let me maybe introduce a new term on this regard. We always knew that there is also a dark side of civil society, and we now start to call it uncivil society. So to have a concrete wording also for those movements, which you are totally rightfully say, that have to be monitored, that have a close eye on. And yeah, thank you very much. And we will now go further in the row of our inputs. And I'm really very sorry to tell you that for technical reasons, we are not able to make it to send you the video message from Helena Dalli, but Giorgio will put a link, a YouTube link on the chat. It's already there, I was told. So you can, if you copy this link to the YouTube channel, then you can see Helena Dalli's video message. Please not now, please during a break or whenever. Yeah, thank you very much. So it's now a real pleasure for me that we also have one of our input givers here in the room. It's Fatsi Wade. She is Senior Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, I suppose. I assume. So please, the floor is yours, Mrs. Wade.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and a good morning to our distinguished participants and also colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to participate in what I believe is a very timely conversation and conference for our time. The spread in many parts of the world of racist extremist movements based on ideologies that seek to promote populist, nationalist, right-wing agendas and racial superiority is deeply alarming. These ideologies establish a climate of hostility between peoples and communities, and they threaten social cohesion, peace, and democracy by defining who the real people are and demonizing the other and denying them their rights. The promotion of one's own rights at the expense of others is the highway to destruction for all society. We have a collective responsibility to condemn all messages that disseminate ideas of racial superiority or hatred and which incite discrimination against certain groups. Political figures, including parliamentarians, have a personal responsibility to use their influence on public opinion to promote the values of diversity and tolerance. The Durban Declaration and Program of Action emphasize their key role in taking concrete steps to promote equality, solidarity, and non-discrimination. Unfortunately, we have observed a growing trend of racist discourse on the part of political figures, including some holding government office, who exploit differences for electoral gain. This phenomena is experiencing a resurgence in both liberal democracies and authoritarian states. Such overt behaviors, which often hide behind the rights to freedom of expression, thought, or assembly, do not constitute part of the normal political process. New technologies, including social media, create new challenges in the propagation of hate speech, which both governments and companies need to address with principled action to protect fundamental rights online. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination obliges states to prohibit activities inciting racial discrimination and to criminalize participation in related organizations, while also recognizing the right to freedom of opinions and expressions. In its general recommendation number 35 on combating racist hate speech, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination provides a set of measures to address all manifestations of racist hate speech, including hate speech by politicians and political leaders. It also provides guidance on the qualification of dissemination and incitement as offenses punishable, stressing that several contextual elements must be taken into account, including the content and form of the speech, the economic, social, and political climate, the position or status of the speaker, the reach of the speech, and the objectives of the speech. The Rabbit Plan of Action also suggests important safeguards relating to the restrictions of free speech. Undertaking measures in the fields of teaching, education, culture, and information in the promotion of interethnic understanding and tolerance is another important step to combat the racist extremist ideologies. Information campaigns and educational policies calling attention to the harms produced by racist hate speech should engage the general public, civil society, parliamentarians, and other politicians, educational professionals, public administration personnel, police, and other bodies dealing with public order. Schools must teach human rights and promote tolerance and acceptance of difference. Education must continue through regular raising of awareness for mutual trust among and between communities. It is essential to address the root causes of populist and racist ideologies. These are rooted in systemic racism and structural discrimination, which are embedded in the cultures and practices of many institutions. Tackling these scourges requires a comprehensive approach as set out by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The 4-point agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality of the High Commissioner for Human Rights further sets out building blocks for tangible and sustainable progress in this regard. A comprehensive approach also requires addressing the economic and social determinants that fuel the spread of racist extremist movements and ideologies in our society. Evidence shows that populist and nationalist ideologies thrive in contexts of economic and social crisis where people feel threatened and unsecured, making migrants and minorities the scapegoats of the complex challenges faced by our societies, offer no solutions to these challenges. To the contrary, nationalist and populist discourses that blame migrants and minorities further sharpen these challenges by exasperating divisions and making societies less safe. Parliamentarians have a key role to play in addressing the root cause of against racism, racial discrimination, and related tolerance. For parliaments, adopt laws, approve the national budget, and oversee the executive branch of government. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is committed to fight against racism and discrimination and stands ready to support you in this endeavor. Thank you.
I thank you very much. You also underlined the connection between social and social crises and people feeling much more attracted by rational ideas and by seeking easy scapegoats. And I think you totally correctly reminded us as parliamentarians that we also should have not a very narrow look on combating racism, but really a broader one, also addressing these issues of social welfare states, for instance. And I also think that it's very important to be aware that all the legal measures and all the tools, what to do, are there, are at the table. What is lacking is political will to put priority on that. And I think if we all agree and all engage our fellow MPs really to put priority on combating racism, xenophobia, and hate, then we really could make a difference. So thank you very much for your input. The next we will have online at our panel is Mr. Danielle Poole. He is CEO from the Expo Foundation. Could you please request for the floor? You have already requested for the floor, so the floor is yours, Mr. Poole.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this interesting and important conference. I work as a journalist, and I've been working as a journalist reporting about the far right and its groups and activities for over 15 years. And the question of normalization when it comes to far right ideas and narratives isn't new, as was presented in the beginning of the conference. So this is a process we've been through, and it's been a kind of a question that's been around since the end of the 80s, and it has raised dilemmas about how to handle these kind of political parties. Should other parties work together with them? Should they be isolated or not? All those questions has been, from my perspective, something that's been along for a quite long time. But what we see now, and I think that's one of the reasons why this conference is well timed as well, is that there's been a shift. There's been a new step in this process of normalization, and I would time it maybe to the so-called migration crisis. Today, the question isn't longer if the far right should be part of the political establishment or not. The question is about how rightist, centrist, and leftist parties are adapting to or using the narrative and policies of the far right. So very shortly, the far right has a political narrative that they've been using for decades. It's the same story all over again about Europe or the country or the local community where they seek support. And the story tells voters that the society is run by this kind of cultural media elite with social and liberal ideas, which in the end will destroy the nations. Kind of a political correct dogma. And this elite has this kind of secret alliance with minorities. So minorities will get whatever they want. And as soon as the minorities, all the problems that, well, let's say, for example, if an immigrant commits a crime, the elite will make sure that no one will know about it. So that the so-called truth about multicultural society is hidden from ordinary people. And the ordinary people is the victim in this story. This has been the story from the far right the last 40 years. And it's actually quite impressive how patient they have been, because they have never changed their way of looking at society or speaking about the society. The only thing that has changed is the rest of us and how we are dealing with this story. So I would say that the big change is that during the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in other political parties kind of borrowing or copying themes and tropes from this narrative. So First of all, maybe as a way of winning back voters. So we are scapegoating minorities instead of dealing with real problems by copying the narrative of the far right. Even if you don't even kind of support it in the end, that's at least a strategy for getting back in power. The other reason is more frightening, I would say, is that inside the more mainstream parties, I think that we now see that party leaders, party establishments actually do believe in this narrative. This is their way of understanding society. This is their way of analyzing it. And of course, this far-right narrative isn't true, but it's true for those who believe in it. And it's also very effectively structured to be fueled by social media platforms. I think there are two very important changes in society that has made this possible, and I think I would like to highlight them to maybe have that as something to get back to into our discussions later. First of all, I think we have to realize that what I call the post-1945 era is over. So I was brought up in a society where if someone sounded like or looked like a fascist, he was disqualified from the political scene. It was kind of enough to make people, to remind people of the consequences of racist language. It was enough to remind people of the consequences of fascist, National Socialist, right-wing populist ideas, because we have this collective memory of the 1945. We have the collective memory of the war crimes of National Socialism and fascism. From my perspective, it's quite clear that that doesn't really, we don't have that anymore. So, and that creates a completely new dimension. So let's say for an organization like Expo, where I work, our work has for many years been doing journalism, where we are trying to explain and expose far-right groups and basically telling the audience, well, can't you see this quote, this way of behavior shows that these groups are has to be regarded as very radical, has to be regarded as radical right parties. And when we did that, that was enough to disqualify them from the political scene. The strategy from the far right now is that, well, we don't care because the public doesn't care that much longer anymore. I think this is a clear case in, for example, let's say France, where we have had Marine Le Pen's project for many years been kind of trying to find a way into the political establishment, changing the name of the party, changing the aesthetics of the party, changing almost everything around the party. And now when we are going to closer and closer to the next election, suddenly new names pop up as with far-right ideas, and they are more radical, they are more outspoken, and they are clearly Islamophobic, clearly kind of adapting to this far-right narrative, and the audience likes it. And the problem for Marine Le Pen is that she has tried to kind of become as mainstream, so much mainstream that the audience would like a more radical alternative. And I think that shows where we are at the moment, and that kind of changes the way many civil society groups will work. And it kind of changes the way we discuss and debate around the questions of defending democracy. Because if our answer is that, well, can't you see these groups are dangerous? If that's our answer, the risk is that the audience will say, well, we see what they are and we kind of like it. Basically, we have to learn to argue why human rights are a good idea. We have to argue why racism isn't a good idea for a society. It's the strategy of just pointing fingers and is over. The other one, which I think will be kind of the next step in this normalization process, is the post-truth era and the conspiracy theories that runs from it. So this is the big trend in US politics, where we've seen the Conservative Party adapting to a conspiracy theory-based rhetorics. And I would argue that that is kind of the next threat to liberal democracy, which in the end would be a threat also against racism and all our tools to defend democracy and fight for a more inclusive society. So I think conspiracy theories will be a bigger problem, and the responsibility here lies on politicians, that we don't want to kind of play with fire and trying to seek support, trying to fight their political opponents with conspiracy theory-based argumentation. So the end of the post-1945 era and the coming increase of conspiracy theories in politics gives us a very alarming situation. I'm not the expert in exactly what to do, but here are some ideas. I think it is crucial that we, from all angles, try to strengthen and defend liberal democratic values, and that is, of course, in legislation and also when it comes to education. Education in itself is crucial. We have to inform the next generation of European citizens of why democracy is a good idea, of this history of an multicultural and multi-ethnic Europe. I think it's crucial that the cooperation between politicians, political parties, NGOs increases over the borders. The far-right groups are an internationalized phenomenon nowadays, and I think the answer has to be internationalized as well. So in that case, from that perspective, this conference is a really good step. I think one of the driving forces of mistrust, which is fueling conspiracy theories, is corruption. And tougher measures against corruption is crucial to stabilize a democracy and the decline of democratic values at the moment.
Could you please sum up?
Yeah, I'm done. Sorry. So, finally, the last point is we now see how independent media all over the European Union is having tougher and tougher times. Independent media and free journalists is a crucial part of how democracy can be defended and vitalized. So strengthening independent media is a crucial part here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poole. I think it was very interesting the way you lined out the narrative of the far right and how it was adapted and used by the mainstream meanwhile, which is really crucial to be aware of that. and also the knowledge that there is no collective consciousness anymore about if somebody appears in a very clear Nazi uniform, what does it mean? Because also the appearance is another one, is a new one, and that we really have to be very alarmed about every attack against democracy and human rights. There is a saying in German, I have no idea whether this is anywhere else as well. It says, racism is not a political opinion, racism is a crime. And I think that could be quite a good guidance for when to create our own narratives and when to analyze, to also use our own analytic tools, what's going on in this society and how do we handle problems that are there, of course, but how are they framed? So thank you very much for this really important input. I'm looking forward to come back to you in the discussion. And now, as Mrs. Rokhaya Diallo could not make it in the morning, but will be on a panel in the afternoon, I will come to the last speaker of our morning's panel, which is Anna Sarah Lind, member of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI. And if Mrs. Lind has not asked for the floor, she had already asked for the floor, so the floor is yours. Mrs. Lind, please.
Dear moderator, distinguished participants at this conference, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak at this parliamentary conference on diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination against racism and intolerance in Europe. As it happens, the title of the conference perfectly describes the raison d'être of the body I represent here today, namely the Council of Europe's European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, known by its abbreviation ECRI. This body not only works against racism and intolerance, but also strives to promote diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination. This is explained and illustrated in the general policy recommendations that together form the ECRI standards and detailed guidelines which policymakers are invited to use when drawing up national strategies and policies in a variety of fields. Among the most blatant forms of racism and intolerance are those reflected in hate speech, and what often follows hate speech, namely violence motivated by hate. Since our hosts today are the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the Swedish Riksdag, our parliament in Sweden, I think it is appropriate to speak about hate speech in politics, but also what politicians and political institutions can do against it. In this context, I would like to start by saying that ECRI very much supports the updating of the Charter of European Political Parties for a non-racist society that was mentioned earlier this morning. As I know colleagues of mine have done on other occasions, I would like to express my great satisfaction that the members of the Parliamentary Assembly have agreed to lead the way in the exercise of updating the Charter, in which ECRI, together with the Parliamentary Assembly as well as the European Parliament, have a shared interest. On behalf of ECRI, I would like to pledge ECRI's readiness to assist in and contribute to this endeavour. As you know, ECRI's main standard on hate speech is its General Policy Recommendation number 15 on combating hate speech. Moreover, in ECRI's 6th monitoring round reports, 1 out of 3 main areas of focus is on hate speech and hate crime. ECRI has noted in recent years that different aspects of hate speech have unfortunately become somewhat of a permanent feature, regardless of the overall theme chosen the year in question. In its annual report for 2018, ECRI deplored that a growing public anxiety about economic, geopolitical, and technological changes is exploited by scapegoating migrants and minorities, including Roma and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. 1 year later, ECRI noted that the various election campaigns of 2019 showed that ultranationalist, xenophobic, racist, and homotransphobic hate speech was once again on the rise and increasingly permitted, and in many cases even set the tone in social media networks. In ECRI's annual report for 2020, one of the main themes was, not surprisingly, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on groups of concern to ECRI. One of the aspects of the pandemic suffered by vulnerable communities have been verbal and physical assaults, as well as intolerant rhetoric from public figures, in particular politicians and media professionals. The pandemic was also abused by various groups and individuals to spread conspiracy theories about the origin of the disease. This included, inter alia, anti-Semitic hate speech, blaming specific persons of Jewish origin or Jews in general for COVID-19, and thereby using age-old stereotypes to stir up anti-Jewish resentments and hatred. Persons of Asian origin or those perceived to be of Asian origin were also targeted at the beginning of the pandemic. Yet, it is not necessarily all gloom and doom. Let me mention some very recent examples of interesting developments, some of which in the context we find in national parliaments. In Greece, an MP of the governing New Democracy political party made public a list of foreign-sounding names of preschool children arguing in a xenophobic manner that Greece was being flooded by foreigners. In a reaction to this, the Greek foreign minister on 6 October against encounter speech, which is one of the main forms of reactions against hate speech called for in ECRI's General Policy Recommendation number 15. The foreign minister thus publicly objected to the xenophobic views of the MP, after which the Greek Prime Minister excluded the MP from his political party. While unfortunately, it is not only politicians who make themselves guilty of racist or xenophobic remarks, there is luckily often popular reactions against it, as shown by an incident which occurred in Leipzig in Germany at the beginning of October, when a Jewish singer was allegedly told to take off his Star of David pendant in order to be served at a hotel. The popular counter speech was immediate, both in social media and in the street outside the hotel where a demonstration was organized. On a different level, ECRI engages in a kind of counter speech by speaking out against racism and discrimination, including by means of statements when circumstances so require. ECRI does not lend its authority to such statements lightly, but has in the past 18 months issued 3 statements prompted by contemporary events across Europe. The first statement, issued in May 2020, took a stand against discrimination and hate speech linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected a number of groups of concern to ECRI, but in particular Roma and migrants. In its second statement, issued in early July 2020, 2 months later, ECRI took a position against racist police abuse, including racial profiling and systemic racism. While the statement was linked to the global protest against the death of George Floyd in the USA, ECRI in it noted that excessive use of force by law enforcement officials against persons belonging to minority groups, the persistent practices of racial profiling and more generally systemic racism is present in Europe as well. This statement was echoed in a very important resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly on ethnic profiling in Europe, which was adopted in January 2021. Sometimes xenophobic hate speech is committed, including by state actors against the whole nation, typically in circumstances of unresolved conflicts. The most recent statement by ECRI, the third I would like to mention here, issued in March 2021, was about preventing and combating ultranationalistic and racist hate speech and violence in relation to confrontations and unresolved conflicts in Europe. As I explained at the beginning of my intervention here, ECRI works against racism and intolerance, including such manifested by hate speech, but it also works to promote diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination in Europe. This is what we do, and we shall continue to do so for as long as necessary. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you very much, Mrs. Lind. As we all know, ECRI really provides us with very concrete and robust suggestions for national legislation that really can change and that really are a basis for activities. I just wanted to mention or to echo that I think that you are totally right when you say that when it comes to economic, geopolitical, and technical or technological shifts, then very often people seek for new answers for their fears. And I would like to quote Paulo Freire from the Church of Liberation, who built a kind of triangle saying the artists have to be teacher and politician, but you also can say that the teacher has to be artist and politician. And you also can say that the politician has to be artist and teacher. And I think that's exactly our role, to translate new circumstances, a new world, which we didn't grow up with, to nowadays, and to explain how people can live securely and securely in this world as well, and how we have to help people how to tackle their fears, how to deal with their fears. And yes, I think that ECRI recommendations are mostly very timely for the legal basis of that, but we still have to do a lot in transforming legal values into really action and into real conception of what is behind. So thank you very much for this input. And also because you tackled the importance of counter speech. I totally agree with you, but I also think that for counter speech, there is additionally necessary a quite robust legal basis how to, for instance, handle in social media hate speech, which will not be combated alone by counter speech, as we know from experience now. So thank you very much. We are now nearly perfectly in time because we missed 2 speakers, so that made it possible to be in time. Thank you very much. We will now have a break for 20 minutes or nearly 20 minutes. And we now have a family photo as well, I assume without the participants online, because Kudu doesn't make it possible to show everybody on the screen. But we will have some ideas of how to make the family photo by Giorgio, where and how. Please.
Yes, I suggest we take the family photo here in the room. I think the light is better than in the hallway, and we can just stand on that side, no, actually that side, and I'll take the pictures.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Wonderful, and after the picture you have some more time for your personal refreshment, and we will start again at 11 with the discussion about all the inputs we've got so far. Thank you very much. So just to inform you also at home that we now managed to play the video of Helena Dalli. It will not be very easy. Those of you who are in the room can see it. Those who are connected via Kudu can later, if I stop talking, then you can see the screen in our room as well. And we hope that you can hear also the sound of Helena Dalli, but you will not be able to see it directly via Kudu. So you see it, the world is not perfect. That's the reason why we are here, to work on it, that it becomes perfect. but it takes some more years, I think, until we have the world, the perfect world which we want to live in. And you will tell me as soon as we are ready to start, because we will start with the video of Helena Dalli now. And we also rearranged a little bit that I can have a look into the kudo system as well and see who of you is taking the floor at home later on.
The sound off.
Okay, we are still working on the sound, but it should be the next minutes that we manage that you see Helena Dalli and her video message.
Anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and other racist hate crimes are increasing at an alarming rate. They have become more and more mainstream, and in recent weeks, we've seen how this incites further violence and undermines the stability of our democracies. Racist and xenophobic hate speech is illegal under EU law. I firmly believe that if we are to uphold our fundamental EU values and apply the fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter, we need a prompt and comprehensive response to the rise of racist and xenophobic hate speech. This Commission decided to tackle these issues openly and on all fronts. In September 2020, under the umbrella of the Union of Equality package, the European Commission adopted an ambitious EU anti-racism action plan, establishing the main policy actions to combat racism for the next 5 years. The aim is to mainstream the fight against racism into all EU policies, and key to this approach is the recognition of structural racism and how it needs to be addressed intersectionally. The action plan, therefore, also includes non-legal measures to address social attitudes, stereotypes, and economic concerns. But we will need all hands on deck at all levels of governance and through different measures to truly turn the tide across the Union. This is why I called on all member states to consult with civil society and equality bodies and adopt national anti-racism action plans by the end of 2022. We will report on their implementation by the end of 2023. The European Anti-Racism Coordination Team is also meeting regularly with the subgroup on the national implementation of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan. The subgroup is now outlining common guiding principles for national action plans against racism with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency and member states, which the Commission aims to publish by the end of 2021. 2 weeks ago, the Commission adopted the first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. Anti-Semitism is incompatible with EU values. Yet, 9 out of 10 Jews in Europe believe that anti-Semitism has increased in their country. With this strategy, the Commission is determined to significantly step up the fight against anti-Semitism. It is Europe's long-term commitment to a safe, inclusive future for our Jewish communities and Jewish life in all its diversity. We also see increasing evidence of anti-Muslim hatred throughout the EU. The European Commission will continue to work with the European Muslim community in a long-term commitment to a safe, inclusive future for our Muslim communities and Muslim life in all its diversity throughout the Union. Next year, on the 21st of March, the Commission will organize a second EU Anti-Racism Summit involving EU institutions, member states, civil society, and equality bodies, as well as grassroots organizations. It will be an opportunity to highlight some achievements. In particular, the Commission's common guiding principles to support the preparation and implementation of national action plans, and to revisit the importance of continuing our joint efforts in fighting against racism in the European Union. Together, we have to take a clear stance and act accordingly, not only through words, but with concrete actions. We in the Commission are committed to do our part, and we look forward to working alongside you all towards a true union of equality. I thank you.
So I thank Helena Dalli for her important statement. Thank you also for displaying it. And now it's up to you. I invite you all for, on the one hand, statements, or on the other hand, questions. If you want to address our panelists, obviously, except Helena Dalli, who was there only via video message, you can do that. We already have one question for the floor from the online system. And I also want to remind you that the goal is really to have some takeaways, to have some concrete suggestions how we could handle nowadays normalization of racism. So maybe you can focus on that. And the first one who asked for the floor on Kudu is Sasha Magazinovic. And here he is, please.
Hello, dear friends. Warm greetings from Sarajevo. Bosnia and Herzegovina is one step away from escalation because of politicians who, among other things, use hate speech. His name is Milorad Dodik, and he is member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is a man who denied the genocide in Srebrenica, attacks the religious identity of the citizens of the Bosnia and Herzegovina, insult journalists and political opponents. He is a man who blocked state institutions because of the High Representative's decision to prohibit the denial of the genocide. Mr. Dodik is the person who brought the country to the edge of the war. Why is this happening? Because he was not stopped on a time, and because, above all, the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina tolerated it and even often chose him as a partner. My message from Bosnia and Herzegovina is that any radicalism should be prevented in the early beginning, because if it's not done, the consequences can be tragic. I call you all, as well as the governments of the countries you come from, to pay attention to Bosnia and Herzegovina and give support to the concrete sanctions against Milorad Dodik that some huge countries talking about. He is radical who is destabilizing Bosnia and Herzegovina. Remember, if a conflict occurs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it will spread to the entire Balkan. And that will not only be the responsibility of nationalists like his, but also of all of us in Europe who did not prevent it, and they could. And we still have a chance to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magazinovic. Even if I cannot estimate the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, what I can mention is that Gregory Stanton defined 10 stages of genocide, and the 10th stage is the ignorance, the denial of genocide. And whenever that happens, we have to be very aware, of course, as well, and alerted. So there, I do not see anybody else at the moment requesting the floor online. I do not see anybody in the room as well. So I will start with one question to Mr. Poole. When you... okay. So, okay, let's first take Mariam Madoum and give her the floor, and Petra Stinen afterwards. So please, Mariam and then Petra.
Hello?
We can hear you and see you, fine.
Thank you. Yes, so I just wanted to bring in a perspective. Speakers have rightly highlighted the shift in the narrative that has resulted in a normalization of far-right ideas and assumptions and such. And that has been adopted, but also further exacerbated by mainstream parties, either for opportunistic motives like electoral gains, or because they simply believe this is true, with mainstream parties in many liberal democracies failing to present a different understanding of reality, right? But beyond narrative, political discourse, and hate speech, I think it is really important to also take stock of a development that is even more worrisome, and that is the adoption of actual policies by mainstream parties, with or without the active support of far-right officials with whom they have increasingly formed government coalitions, and that target racialized groups for discriminatory treatment, thereby developing an institutional infrastructure that relies on the subjugation of these groups and that further entrenches institutional and systemic racism. So I think it's really important to look beyond words, beyond assumptions, to actual policies that are now adopted that are as explicit as they can get in targeting racialized groups. And a second point that I wanted to add as well is I agree with various speakers who have raised the importance of the economic and social context, and especially crises that create a fertile breeding ground for all these developments. But another contextual factor that further exacerbates structural and systemic racism, for me, is the increase in attacks on the rule of law and the judiciary, but also other institutions. We've heard from media, but also civil society organizations and even academics. So that is various stakeholders, basically. All these stakeholders, they take up the role of monitoring, exposing, challenging, or putting an end to the discrimination of racialized groups, or even the processes of racialization that are now under attack. And this can range from jailing judges and academics in some countries to also dissolving critical anti-racist organizations in others, putting limits on academic freedom, even in countries that we still consider really liberal democracies today, to making sure courts are made up of judges that are known to defend regressive policies through political appointments and such. I think it's really important to also look at these, this development and how this further entrenches racism. As was mentioned before, dismantling structural racism requires a holistic understanding and approach. So this particular element, I think, is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you go away, I just want to mention, thank you first of all for this warning. Second, I'm really happy that we do not only have members of parliament in our conference, but also a lot of representatives from civil society organizations. May I ask you maybe also to tell us a little bit where you are from? What is your background?
Apologies for not introducing myself first.
Ask all the others to do that in future as well. Thank you.
Yes, so my name is Mariam Hamadoun. I'm a senior policy officer with the Open Society Justice Initiative based in London from Belgium, but I also have a very, very long standing experience in activism against racism, Islamophobia, and also part of the feminist movement. So thank you.
Thank you very much also for letting us know the context you work in. So I'll move further to Petra Steenan, MP from the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you very much, Petra. I'm a senator, which is a little bit different than an MP, but we talked about it yesterday, about being a part-time and a full-time politician. Well, I'm here for 24/7 fighting against racism. And I have a question, I think, to all of the panelists, but most specifically to Mr. Poole, about the silence of the middle. And I've noticed that a lot of people in the middle who would want to speak up have become afraid as well to speak up because of all the hate they get. So how can we strengthen the middle, the voices of reason? And I've noticed as well, actually this morning there was an article in a Dutch newspaper that language has become very important. So there is now an attack on people who are called woke, people who are actually speaking up for human rights. So this is something I'm looking into as well. Maybe we can use this in our recommendation as well. How can we claim the language back? Because in my dictionary, being woke means that you're awake to the racism in society and that you speak up for human rights of everybody. So how to wake up the middle and make them speak up, and also, you know, give legal protection to these voices of reason?
As I do not see any others at the moment, I also would like to add a question to Mr. Poole. You mentioned that that you think that the mainstream politicians not only take over the narrative of racist ideology, but also start to believe in that and really live that in their expression of policy. I would. That really frightened me, to be honest. Yeah. So I would ask you first whether there is any evidence on that, or whether you have any examples on that, how this works in various countries, and also a little bit similar to what Petra asked about the speechless middle. How do you think? What are the perfect measures or perfect means to address those who are not the real racists or the real xenophobic people, but those who do not reflect on that and simply take over some saying, some language? How is it possible to raise awareness among those? Some mentioned conspiracy, but that came with Corona as well. And I also asked myself, how can we address those who just participate in rallies and take over some anti-Semitic language, not reflecting what it means, not reflecting where it comes from? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And let me see. Yeah, Mr. Poole, you asked for the floor. Please, you get it.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions. And I would like to say thank you to Mariam as well. A very good point, I think, about the real policies here. It's not only about words. And I think that is partly kind of an answer to one of the questions. What is the evidence of my statement that we see politicians from the middle starting to believe in this far-right narrative? Well, we'll see it in the policies that they adapt. So, I mean, the narrative is sort of a description of the problem, and the policies is a solution to the problem. So, and narrative and policies often are connected. And I think, I mean, this is the way I look at politics. I think politics is a question of who has the momentum. Most people don't care that much about politics, and some politicians are not in it for the ideology. They are in it for power. They are in it for trying to fix problems, and they will adapt to the current way of understanding and speaking about the problems that we have. And from my perspective, it seems like the so-called migration crisis in 2015 kind of created a situation where a lot of politicians who never really thought about migration, never really thought about questions of racism or inclusion, suddenly had to deal with a lot of angry people and a lot of feelings. And in a way of try to adapt to that new situation, it's clear that the far right created a narrative that was strong enough for people to understand, to kind of adapt to. And I think one of the reasons why is that we have to, so most of us feel that we are not going in the right direction at the moment. And I think that's maybe what we all can kind of have in common. So what is wrong with our society? Why is it segregated? Why why do we have so much problems to get Europe to come together? And I think the far right has come up with an idea of that, and that is an old idea. The idea that in the end, we have given too much space, too much power, too much attention to the minorities. And we have to start to look at the needs of the majority population of Europe. And I think that that is a quite good offer to a lot of politicians. And secondly, that was the question of the mainstream. I think when you look at policies, that's my answer to that. We see policies that comes from mainstream parties that would, if we didn't know who invented it, we would guess it came from the far right. And the silence of the middle, I'm quite. I think someone said, I think we have to connect questions about racism and intolerance to democracy overall. So in the end, the middle and the big middle will not be really worried if until their own world and their own ordinary life is threatened. So if we start to connect the threat against democracy, the threat against your rights to the question of everyone's rights, that might be a way of shifting the agenda and pushing parts of the middle towards an agenda of inclusion and a stronger democracy. I think we've seen, just to have some kind of good example, I think we've seen that in Sweden. So parts of the middle, the kind of liberal middle, has taken some real clear stance against this development during the last 2 or 3 years. And it's been done by a few people that has raised their voices, that has trying to show some real effects around the globe, in Europe and in Sweden, when it comes to liberal democracy, the threat against liberal democracy. So I think we will have to try to push parts of that middle with the question of, in the end, what kind of Europe do we want to see in the future? And I think we should use the United States as the frightening example of where we will end up if we don't take this seriously. And it seems like the events in January at the US Senate also woke some people up, where we actually saw these ideas and these the supporters of Donald Trump entering the Senate, and that was kind of the end station of this mobilization. So that was my kind of very overall answer. I think it's possible, and I think we have to talk about democracy overall and connect the questions of racism and intolerance to that.
Well noted. Thank you very much. The next on my list is here in the room. It's Stefan Schennach, also a senator from Austria.
Thank you so much. I think something is very worried in Germany and in Austria. There are big movement against vaccination, and they are doing demonstration. And let's say there are some normally people who are, I don't know why, but they are afraid and they are against. But in this group, there are people from the far right. There are people who want to destroy democracy and pluralism. And this makes worried when you see what they are doing in Germany. and what is they're doing in Austria. And tomorrow they will have again a big demonstration under the title, it's our national day, the Day of Freedom. And I'm sure that we can hear a lot. My son is doing for an NGO every year the racism report of Austria. And I asked him for the new report what you saw in the work. And he said, exploding is anti-Semitism. And since Black Lives Matter, he said it's very interesting. We have always this question in the racism report, but now it's not so growing as it grew up in the past. And still all what is connection with anti-Muslim inside. So in France, Germany, Austria, maybe Roberto can tell us if it's also in Italy. It makes fear what is going on the anti-Semitism sector, because it's really heavy. In Austria, they made an extra press conference to show how many cases we had in the last year. And I think this new group, let's say, against vaccination, I answered in the last 48 hours 600 emails of them. You think I'm stupid, but I think I take it seriously and give them answers. So they write me back. So it's really hard job. Also last night, I had about 50 or 80 of them. But it's interesting, how is there any bridge over this gap in the society? I'm thinking about that. My original profession is to be a pedagogic man. And so for me, it's always very dangerous when we have no contact to a part of the society which goes an own way, which the majority not understand. But it's dangerous if we have such big gaps in a society. And we will see what is doing with our democracy. And I was also very feared was when in Germany, in the election campaign, the German EPP realized that the result will be bad, that Mr. Laschet and Mr. Söder immediately used the wording regarding Afghanistan about refugee, the waves of refugee. To think with such a rhetoric, you make your result better. This is unbelievable as it works, and we know from the right-wing party in Austria that by every election they are using this.
Thank you very much. As I do not have any requests, Furat, please, and Roberto afterwards. Furat from Belgium and then Roberto from Italy.
Thank you, Petra. Just maybe a question to the panel. I had a discussion last weekend with the two daughters of my best friend, 12 and 14. I asked them, what kind of political message or from which party do you see first on TikTok and other social media platforms? And they told me most of the time it's from extreme right party like Vlaams Belang in Belgium. And it learned me that a party like an extreme party, a right party like Vlaams Belang, they are spending more than 1 million on online advertising only from this year. It learns me that we need to have a discussion as well on how parties are financed and what they're doing with this kind of money, because it's clear that they have a lot of resources to be sure that there is a next generation that is feed with this kind of intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you. Roberto, please.
Yes, I'm very, very interested about that discussion of this morning because, as Stefan told, in Italy we had a similar problem, and all you know that we have for a long time, for quite a long time also, a very important figure of our interior minister that was, I believe we can say, very racist and used a very strong hate speech that I believe was particularly dangerous because let people understand and believe that is correct and that you can do something like this and no one can touch you and also no one can judge you. I'm very I really believe that the problem is that we had a long time until 10 or 20 years ago that racism was something that was particularly judged as negative in society, and maybe people already had inside and cultivate inside racism, but believe they can't show that outside. That was not a solution because, okay, it's a problem also that, but was something that can start to be a solution. And nowadays, the point is that many activity and many kind of speech and many kind of many things that journalists brought on newspaper and something like this, everyone told is not racist, okay, but we know and we understand exactly that is racism, and is racism that they believe they can show totally without problem. So, as we told in the break, I believe we need to work more about all political party. We need to involve particularly the political party that are in the middle and don't say they are racist, and I believe they are not, but too many times that they are not so strong and so clear against racism and hate speech. I believe we have to involve more that kind of party, and we have to do a work in society. And I believe the work we have to do in society, as we told, who was there, so some of you was there in Bundestag in Berlin last time we met there, I believe is culture. We need to do a strong investment in culture of people because we lose a lot of culture capability in our country, in all our country. We lose capability of people to read, to understand what they read, to know history. So we need a strong and common investment in culture to face against racism and against hate speech. And last thing I want to tell you, in Italy, in Italian Senate exactly, we created a ad hoc committee about that. It's very interesting. The president of that ad hoc committee is my colleague that is a senator. We have in Italy 5 senators nominated by the President of the Republic. She is a survivor of Auschwitz. She was a young girl in Auschwitz and now is an Italian senator nominated by the President of the Republic. She asked us to organize this ad hoc committee, and now she is the president. I believe we can do something together, the No Hate, the Parliamentary Alliance and that ad hoc committee, because I believe it's a very, very interesting opportunity to work together.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And Mamadou is the last on my list now. And afterward, I would like to invite the panelists to maybe reflect on what was said and to share their thoughts.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Very inspiring reflections and interesting reflections I'm hearing. I just have 2 comments or questions that I want to put out there so that maybe the panelists might reflect on them. The first one is the normalization process that is taking place when it comes to racism. As it was mentioned here earlier by my colleague, Mr. Rampe, once upon a time when we talk about racism or we hear people speak in racist terms, we react very strongly because racism was perceived to be something negative and everybody would take a very firm stance against it. Now things have changed and the narrative has changed. There is a growing acceptance and normalization of racism. And what even makes it more scary is the fact that policymakers, politicians that are at a high level that people look up to and listen to do use, for example, freedom of expression as a legitimate ground to be able to use hate speech. And they do this because, you know, they want to sound populist and they want people to love them and people to vote for them. They don't think about the consequences anymore. It's more about how many votes I can get. And I just wonder if the politicians and the policymakers are the leaders of our countries, our communities, and people look up to. If they are the ones that are actually using this rhetoric, if they are the ones that are normalizing racism, what do we need to do to be able to somehow put a stop to that? And I know the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, that's the work that we're trying to do, to make sure that we push back as much as possible and then make sure that we encourage as many policymakers as possible to take a firm stance against hate speech and racism. But I would like to hear if there are any, for example, good examples, recommendations as to what we need to do to curb this development that we're seeing within policymakers. The second question is when it comes to legislation. As policymakers, our job is to make sure we have legislation that will protect our citizens and our residents. That is our job. But what we have been seeing also in some member state countries is that we have legislation that would infringe upon the rights of our residents. I'll give you an example. For example, they have laws that are forbidding, the hijab. And this is a gendered form of racism. So where you have the state that has a main responsibility of protecting its residents and citizens would turn around and have legislation that instead of protecting, but would infringe on the rights of its citizens and its residents, the rights to freedom of religion and the rights to assembly. And that is a huge problem that we need to look at, not only from a racist perspective, but from an intersectional perspective, because, for example, a law or legislation that is banning the hijab do not only affect freedom of religion, but also affects women who are already victimized because of their gender. So it creates a double victimization that not individual create, but the state creates. I would like us to hear your comments on that. What do we need to do in order to be able to tackle such developments? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for our panelists, in a nutshell, we are asking about ourselves about, I wouldn't say gaps in society, I would say division of society, and we saw where it led to at the US, for instance. It is about public funding and how we can make clear that public funding of parties may not be used for advertisement for hate in social media. It is about that racism is not clandestine anymore, but openly and well accepted, and how also culture could be used to hinder that. And it is also about the question of legislation, for instance, and when it comes to legislation, infringes human rights and freedoms, how to tackle that. I think the question of intersectionality, we will have our own panel in the afternoon, so there could be also room for that then there. But if our panelists now also want to say anything about the intersectionality, you are very welcome, of course. And may I ask who would like to start? If I look at Mrs. Wade, because she's in the room, I can look at you, I cannot look at all the others. Would you like to start maybe?
I think, concerning the issue of intersectionality, I think, I know that we will have a session and we'll explore it, but just from a, personal experience, as a Black woman who also happens to have, Australian nationality, I think the way that, I am perceived within, I guess, systems would be based on my nationality, right? And if my nationality being one of the Western European countries, just in that context, would seem to afford me privilege of based on nationality. But my experience as a Black woman is not that of, you know, the perception of my nationality. And I think that within, you know, societies, there are people that have multiple forms of intersecting identities that have historically been marginalized, and you know, systemic racism has played a key role in that. And I think that one of the things that, from our organization's perspective, when we came out with the report that seeks to address systemic racism, you know, we offered 4 points for states to really consider. And I think that when we're thinking about all those frameworks within a society, when we're looking at freedom of expression and what is allowed and what is not allowed in the law, I think that the first thing is to really own up to the mistakes of the past and to actually recognize that members of our communities have historically been experiencing various forms of oppression. And I think that the role of parliamentarians, the role of, you know, politicians is very, very critical in this because of the decision making. And, you know, within the representation, when we talk about minority groups, a lot of the times they're not represented in seats where decisions are made. And so decisions are being made on their behalf. And so I think what I would say is I would urge, you know, parliamentarians and politicians, you know, based on this personal experience that I'm explaining, is to say that there are members within your society that might seem minority based on numbers and based on the stats. But it is imperative because we will not get to a society where we will experience equality, where we'll experience justice and fairness when there are members within that society that are not participating in all aspects of life. And I think that our report is, you know, is a report that could help, you know, governments, and, you know, the steps that we talk about in there in terms of, you know, listening to the voices of, you know, people who are oppressed within your communities, you know, redress and the need for reparation, and also the need, you know, to speak up and to ensure that there's justice. And so I think that there's a role, and I think we also need to come to a place where when we do have spaces like this and we're having conversations, we leave here with a commitment, and not just a commitment to meet each other at the next conference, but to actually say, okay, what is it that I'm going to do when I get back to my respective, you know, even for my constituents or for my country or organization that I represent. And I think that's important, is like, now we need to ensure that we are acting on the things that we're talking about and not just continuing to talk about them.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Rudström-Ruin also asked for the floor. You have it.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Great. So very many important contributions have been made, and let me just comment on a few from my perspective with a global approach to the work. I think, as I said initially, we are at a juncture where the trend is extremely negative for democracy globally, worldwide. But we are also at a juncture where we can see the possibilities for precisely gather forces due to the critical situation. The need to focus on the very quick negative steps that have been taken during the COVID-19, and where we can see a number of features, including restricting the role of parliamentary assemblies, legislative bodies, including the pressure on civil society and media. That also means that there is now a strengthened resolve among many actors, both countries and civil society actors, to do something about it. So we do have an opportunity to join forces in a new way. And for that, leadership is, of course, required. And I think that the multilateral cooperations will be crucially important. From our point of view, we very much welcome, for instance, the UN Secretary General's new overriding approach under the umbrella of our common agenda, precisely focusing on the need for a more inclusive decision-making on a global level, and focusing also on the young generation. I think this is the key for a lot of the things that we need to do. How to include the young? How can we ensure that political participation starts early, that the preconditions are there for young persons to actually come and feel that their voices are heard. From our point of view in the Foreign Ministry, in the drive for democracy, which I mentioned, we have a special focus on the young generation. I think everybody from their perspectives need to focus on this. Secondly, civil society in general. Civil society is under strong pressure, but civil society is under pressure because what they do matters. So this is also where we need to focus a lot of our attention. We can see that we need to rethink a little bit how we can best support civil society actors worldwide, and this is an area where we are very eager to collaborate with others and share experiences, but ensuring that their voices can still be heard, that their platforms are there, will continue to be extremely important. And finally, again, what I said about knowledge. When I meet civil society actors, they witness that what is now happening, it is happening somehow in shades of gray. It is not through violent, huge steps necessarily, but through small steps that democracy is undermined. So in order to be able to act, we need to act based on facts, and therefore we need to monitor and to expose what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Poole also asked for the floor.
Hi again. Very much is already said. I will try to partly at least answer the question of what can be done. I think we are in a kind of strategic dilemma here. So on one hand, we see democracy being threatened, which kind of gives us the alarmic feeling that this has to be defended. Democracy as we know it has to be defended against far-right groups, against conspiracy theory groups, and so on. But on the other hand, democracy as we know it today isn't really enough to solve all the problems. So there are still a situation where minorities in Europe is living in an ordinary life where systemic racism is part of their daily life. And that, if our democracy kind of accepts that, I don't know if that is just what we should defend. So I think the problem here is partly, I'm not sure that counter speech, so to speak, is the way forward. So if we should kind of sit and wait for them to say something awful and then react, I think we are one step behind. So the first thing would be, so what I would like to see basically is an agenda of reforms, an agenda where enough lawmakers can say, well, we want to deepen democracy, we want to make democracy even better, and in that reform agenda, that has to include also those who has maybe fallen into this far-right narrative because they are dissatisfied with their life, they don't trust politicians anymore, and so on. Partly parts of the kind of white majority population in Europe whose life isn't that good either. So deepening democracy has to make their lives better as well. Maybe this is not so concrete, but it's based more like a baseline in a strategic, from a strategic point of view. I don't think we should sit and wait for them to say awful things and then try to stop that. I think the time is here to speak more about what we want and what we mean by a democratic society, which has to be more than just defend it as it is today.
Thank you very much. I want to mention that in Germany there is a debate going on about the well-fortified democracy enabling law, which is this proactive approach which you are asking for. And it's not done yet, but we will see how our next government will do with that. But I think that's the same idea, and it really seems very important to me. So may I ask Mrs. Lind whether you also would like to reply a minute or so? If so, please ask for the, yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Daniel, for your suggestion of creating an agenda for deepening democracy. I totally agree with you, of course, both as a person, a human being, and also as a member of ECRI. I would like to add to that of course counter-speech is not the only thing. I found it interesting to raise that as a part of my intervention earlier this morning. But I should also underline that we cannot talk about these issues without talking about the importance of having an institutional infrastructure for combating racism and really achieving and realizing human rights. Here, the importance of national agencies are well known, but also, of course, of local municipalities and local civil society being linked to the democratic dialogue. And I was very happy to hear as well from other persons during the debate today here that the rule of law is stressed and underlined as crucial for being part of this infrastructure, of course. Now, the ECRI has suggested both formal and informal structures for achieving more dialogue and information. And this is something that goes very well in line with the questions that have been raised here today, I would say, especially for young people and for children. And we have been working on matters relating to codes of conduct, self-regulations, and also monitoring that could be measures to continue developing and study more how that can be handled. I would say that law as such is always something that is developing and changing. And if we develop and change the legislative structures and the laws of our different states in the Council of Europe, then we also need to have valid information, and therefore the data collection and information gathering that we have heard about today is indeed crucial and necessary. I would also like to say that protection of human rights and combating of racism should not be, and this is me as a lawyer talking, something that is less strong from one year to another, but should develop and become stronger and stronger over time. And if we look at the realization of human rights like that, as we should, according to the principles of law, the past and our experiences of the past are indeed very, very important to have in mind. I will conclude now because I see that the time is almost up. But I have been delighted to listen to every one of you, and I thank you all very much for the knowledge and the information and this conference today, and all the valuable concrete input. I'll take it with me for the upcoming meetings and the work for ECRI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I really want to echo you. I also want to thank everybody for the valuable contributions from the panel, from the floor. And I'll try the impossible and try to sum up in 7 recommendations or takeaways which we maybe could take out of this conference from this part of the normalization of racism. First, I think that we really should look into concrete mainstream politics and screen it on racial xenophobic contents. And if we find them, name it and blame it and make it clear what it is, not leave it camouflaged. Second, I think it would be very helpful to draw a very clear line between freedom of speech on the one hand and racism on the other hand. And we had a debate recently about, with a hearing on to develop a handbook for parliamentarians, where we also tackled this topic there. And there was the idea to have concrete examples. What is okay and what is not okay? What is freedom of speech and what is hate and cannot be accepted? Third, we proactively should put democracy in the core of all our debates and political struggles, and show how superiority of what kind ever usually wants to destroy democratic structures and gather forces over parties, and also foster democracy education, and with that foster democracy as such. There will be another point that's referring on that. Fourth, to really have a holistic approach, not just to tackle the end of the pipe, to the racism, but to really have a holistic approach when it also comes to social security, to changes at the global level that frightens people, and try to give answers that could help people to get orientation in a world that they haven't known so far. Fifth, I think that it's totally important to have representation, visibility of members of minorities, to really put them as equal in the society, as equal as they should be, not seen as black or male or female or old or young or whatever, but to be of same value. That's as a concrete contribution to create inclusiveness, also when it comes to ethnicity, age, gender, disability, and other characteristics. And I think that we also at Equality Committee, we will work on next steps. We debated about that when we debated the quota, the gender quota, and that is a first step, but it has to include much more. So to take, and also to take political participation serious and start with it at a very early age of people. Sixth is to secure space for civil society and to work on this well-fortified democracy and to enable it. And last but not least, to secure and fund institutional infrastructure to fight racism, xenophobia, and hatred, including diverse reporting points where people who got victims of what racist insults ever can easily report without barriers, and to use that also to collect disaggregated data to really work on that and to really can make evidence-based decisions on what we see of racism, xenophobia, and hatred in our society. So I hope that summarizes it more or less. It's not easy to summarize 2.5 hours of debates, but Let's take it as a first result. I want to thank you all for your active participation online and here in the room. And we now have nearly 1.5 hour lunch break, and we will gather again 1:30. Enjoy your break. Thank you very much.